So the first question I have is that as a journalist and an author, how do you decide on what to cover and work on?
Sure. I'm very lucky at this point in my work that I'm not confined to a beat. For many, many years, when I started out, I would cover, I was on something specific, whether it was politics or criminal
Mm.
justice, and at this point, a lot of my story ideas come from reading extensively and having a question that grabs me by the shoulder and will not let me go. That was the case for the magazine story that turned into Nomadland, another work I've done. When I teach my students at Columbia Journalism School, I don't know why we joke and we call it the haunted nugget. It's like having a little nugget of something that just hovers on your shoulder and whispers in your ear and keeps asking, what the heck is going on here? And you can't sleep. You're thinking about it. You want to know what's going on. So thankfully, um, I feel like if I'm so curious about what's going on, other people may be as well. So there's, some essential tension and curiosity driving these story topics. But I try to do stuff. One of my particular interests is subcultures, and not just countercultures, but just groups that are brought together, sometimes by adversity, sometimes by common interests, but how these people and how they come together, what they can show us about the mainstream of culture. So, what we can learn about the center from standing on the outside.
All right. So on that note, could you please tell us about how your career started and evolved after your college and university?
Sure. I started out in publishing, and this is going to sound kind of bizarre, but I was living in downtown New York during 9/11, and I,
Oh,
I saw the second explosion. And like a lot of people in New York at the time, my reaction was not, we need to start wars. My reaction was, we need to do, I wanted to be a part of communication and better interconnection in the world. Um, and I felt that urgency. So I left where I was. I had been the intern that opened the first box of Harry Potter's at Scholastic Press in the United States. And I started going to graduate school at Columbia part time at night. I didn't want to quit my day job, as they say. And I fell passionately in love with journalism, just because I feel that it's a very lucky position. You get to be a student forever. You get to ask
yeah.
questions that no other circumstances would give you the audacity to ask. And you get to learn forever and you get to share that through writing. And for me, that just has always felt like such a gift. Even before I got to write the sort of things I'm passionate about, to me, I just felt so fortunate and so lucky that anybody would hire me as a job for my work to go out in the world and learn about things on behalf of other people and share it. That just seemed too much like a dream.
Definitely sounds like a dream come true. So, could you also tell me how different or similar the processes of writing Nomad Land or Snowden's Box were?
Sure. Um, Snowden's box was more personal. It was different. So um, for Nomadland, that started. I mean, like one similar thing is they both started out as cover stories for Harper's Magazine. When I wrote the story that became Nomadland, it came out in 2014, and it was the first time I'd ever written for Harper's. And I had pitched a story, and I ended up going out and sleeping in the desert in Arizona in a tent and running around. And it was a challenging story to report, but I was allowed to grow it into a book. So a publisher, an editor read it and said, "Oh my gosh, would you want to expand it into a book?" And I said, "Are you kidding me? I'm fascinated. There's so much more. I just feel like I've scratched the very edge of it." Um, with Snowden's box, it was a little different because it was all in retrospect, looking at, it's something very strange happened when I was reporting Nomadland. The events of Snowden's box were also unfolding, in that I received in May of 2013 a cardboard box, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, contained the entire national security archive direct from Edward Snowden. So basically,
Oh,
one of the biggest intelligence leaks in the US, maybe the biggest since the Pentagon Papers. And at the time, the people who were speaking directly with him didn't know if somebody was trying to frame them or if the source was legitimate. So they had to be very careful. And they were quite close to my best friend. This is the filmmaker Laura Poitras, who did the film, Oscar-winning film Citizen 4. So Laura asked my friend Dale, do you know somebody who would be willing to receive a box and somebody who you trust enough mutually that they would not ask any questions? And that's how I ended up receiving it. So for Dale and I to tell that story, we're immersion journalists. We go out into the field and we try to do deeply human stories that come from spending a lot of time with people and learning through their experiences. So this was very different, and the story kind of found us. And for that reason, I think in some ways it's more intimate. Although I think they're both intimate. This one is more direct. It's really talking about getting thrust into surveillance culture when you're not somebody who's not fluent in national security and you have to learn very quickly. But more than that, it's a story about friendship and about even in an era where people rely on things like encryption, just kind of underneath it all, realizing that the trust between networks of human beings who rely on each other in one way, in some ways, is the most powerful encryption. It's really every important piece of communication relies on that trust. So it was a very analog story about a very digital circumstance.
all right. Well, I mean, yeah, the story literally showed up on your doorstep as
Quite
well.
literally, right?
Yeah. All right. So, moreover, how did Nomadland end up getting the film treatment, and what was it like being at the Oscars, and what did the entire experience just feel like for you?
Oh, it was surreal, right? So um, Nomadland as a book seemed quite possibly like the least likely candidate for
Mhm.
adaptation into a Hollywood feature, in that, um, you know, I think of Hollywood and sometimes I think of like youth, sex, money. Do you know what I mean? Just
Yeah.
we live in an ageist society where people for a long time haven't been interested in the stories of older people or people wrestling with poverty and people living on the margins. So, in many ways, this was not something that people saw as a very appetizing story for Hollywood. It was kind of amazing. But there was a woman her name is Jasmine Lake, and her job was to basically find literary works for adaptation at a company called United Talent Association in UTA in California. And she fell in love with the book and became its first
Mhm.
advocate. And gosh, I think she was in her 20s at the time. And it was kind of amazing because this is a book about older people. So once she decided to represent it, um, I liked her very much, but figured nothing would happen because I have other friends who've been approached by people in Hollywood, and often someone takes an interest, but nothing happens. That's the normal situation. So I was quite surprised when Frances McDormand decided to option it along with Peter Spears, an actor and producer. They teamed up and decided to do it together, and then later brought on the director Chloe Zhao. Frances had been at, I think it was the Toronto Film Festival, and saw Chloe's film, The Rider. And that's how that all came together. And when they decided that, as Chloe had in many of her prior films, they wanted to bring in quote unquote real people. It always makes me laugh to say when they say real people, because I kind of think we're all real people. But they were very interested in bringing some of the people I'd spent 3 years following around in the desert and elsewhere, and bringing them into the film as first time actors. And for me, that was the most exciting thing, because I think in a culture where we look at people in a very limited way, we look at, you know, you're a journalist, you're a waitress, you're a guitar player, and we see people as their main avenue of productivity and nothing else, which is a shame. And then we see them get older, and in the US, people are pretty dismissive, and I think there's a prejudice against older people. So we see people in this very limited way. One of, everybody contains multitudes. To quote Walt Whitman, we're vast. Um, So to see these people who, in many ways, had been written off and cast aside by our society because they did not win in the great casino of the economy, and they were older and they were women. So to see these people get an opportunity later in life to be first time actors alongside the beautifully talented people like David Strathairn and Frances McDormand, and not only to have the opportunity to do it, but to absolutely slay. I mean, they were fantastic. Linda and Swanky in particular. There was talk about Swanky possibly getting a nomination herself. So in my mind, that was the most exciting thing, seeing these people who really um, had been kind of thrust aside unfairly, and just seeing like, look, when you give people an opportunity, look what they can do. And just think about how much untapped talent and how many gifts are out there that don't get to be shared because we're so narrow minded about how we look at people, particularly as they age.
Did you feel that the movie like well adapted your work, and you think like it was faithful to the original
I don't
book
know
as
that I
well?
believe that the job of a movie is to be faithful, if that makes any sense. I think that film and, fictionalized films.
Like movies and books have entirely different jobs as well, and also
And I
they're
think I
of
think if
course
you
bound
kind
by
of glue it,
runtimes and all.
yeah, I wouldn't
Yeah.
want, I mean, the movie stands on the shoulders of much of my work. So the older guy who hugs Francis in the opening scene is somebody I reported on and met more than a decade
Oh.
before the film was made. He was living just outside a company town called Empire in Nevada that was getting shut down.
Hmm.
So many of the locations in the movie and so many of the people and so many of the circumstances came from the reporting, but it cuts a different storyline through that world, if it makes sense. The director apparently for many years was really into writing fan fiction, I think related to comic books. So I almost think about this as fan fiction, in that you take a world, but you take the characters and they do somewhat different things in the same world, if that makes sense.
No, I totally get what you mean. All right, so moving on, what are you currently working on, and what else do you have planned?
Yeah, so right now, it's a bit of a strange time in the United States. Um,
Yes.
I wrote a cover story for the Atlantic magazine that came out in the spring of 2022, just before the Supreme Court handed down the Dobbs decision, which
Mhm.
basically removed a right of reproductive freedom from the Constitution of the United States. It used to be guaranteed that women would have, federally on a constitutional level, the right to end early pregnancies if they so chose. And um, people knew that right was going to be taken away. And it had really become, in many ways, I know it's different all over the world, but it had become, a fundamental freedom in our culture, and one that unfortunately not everybody had equal access to, and that's another story. But a lot of people were preparing. It was a subculture of its own. People were getting ready for the right to be removed and to help people. I mean, if you think about people who have been, in particular, victims of domestic violence or poverty, and people who are not ready to have a child or not do not want to have a child, and they knew that many people would be in emergency circumstances soon, and they were preparing for that to happen. So I wrote about them in a piece called The Atlantic Underground. And I have to tell you, it got more press than anything I've ever done except for Nomadland, because the Supreme Court decision came out like a month or two afterwards. And people knew that it was going to happen, but I think because there were so many crazy things happening and, post COVID, and um, people weren't, the mainstream wasn't paying attention. So when the story came out, the people in these underground networks, they want people to know that they exist because otherwise nobody can access the networks. But they also don't want to get arrested. They don't want people to know who they are. So when I finished the story, I think they trusted me because the story
Mm.
accomplished that. And suddenly they were all, it was go time. It was, everything that they'd been preparing for was coming to fruition. So basically, I continue to follow them, and now I'm maybe 3/4 of the way done with the manuscript for my next book.
Oh, all right. Well, I look forward to that as
Thank you.
well. So, on that note as well, how do you think that the Trump administration, I think their policies may continue to affect your work in the future as well? Because you already told me about this decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening, it's funny, a lot of the time I write about people who've been pushed into the margins, and I just feel like, unfortunately, that's going to be so many more people. When I write about people who I think have been unfairly pushed aside, I always hope that my work will become irrelevant. Like people will look at it and one day and say, "This is so crazy! I can't believe that things were that way." But sometimes it's sad, when I wrote Nomadland, after I wrote it, now there are homelessness in the US and particularly people living out of vehicles has gone up quite a bit. You always hope you'll share the story of something that's unfair and maybe it'll get better, but that doesn't always happen. And I think that's happening here. I think, for example, Trump under Trump, it is a lot easier for people to make not having a house a crime and being out in public when many people can't afford houses. Wages have been flat while rent keeps going up. People have nowhere to go. And the idea that somehow that should be a crime when it's really a failure of our system as a nation is really disturbing to me. So, that's one example. I just think there's going to be anybody who was slightly on the edge before, I think is at risk of being pushed over the edge now. I mean, obviously, the first people we've seen that happen with are immigrants. Even in New York, where still things still feel pretty normal, apart from the fact that everybody's depressed over Trump. The initial impact that we have seen is that there have been raids by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to do mass deportations, and many of them are illegal according to our own laws. They're just doing these sweeps. They're not using legitimate warrants. Often they're not presenting signed bench warrants. So they're taking advantage of people who don't know what their rights are. And it's really upsetting. We've also seen in terms of rights for the LGBTQ community, that's already starting to get stripped away. So while right now they're mostly targeting trans people, I really think that when they push against one minority, whether it's a gender minority or racial minority, we all need to pay attention because they will be coming for everybody who's not like them. I mean,
There's nothing stopped.
there's nothing, I know. I mean, we've referred to some of it as Christo-fascism. And, you know, I'm not a Christian and I'm queer. So, and even if it weren't me, um, lots of my friends, my community. So we're all in a position now where it's all hands on deck. I think people are very overwhelmed at the pace of, Musk is basically disemboweling the entire government. We think he's a maniac and a narcissist, which I would also say of Trump. And I think people are overwhelmed. So whenever I speak with people who care when I'm home, I tell them pick one issue and see what you can do that's concrete to help people or to create change. But you can't try to do everything. And if you try to focus on everything, you will not get out of bed in the morning because it's just too much. It's overwhelming. And I think that's by design. It's like the policies in war that they used to call shock and awe, when it's just a complete barrage. The idea is everybody will be so overwhelmed by it. It will be so huge that there's no fighting it. So I feel like we can't give in to that psychology. I think that's part of, they want us to get depressed and they want us to do nothing. And instead, I think we need to focus on, if we all focus on one small thing we can do, at least we feel empowered and we don't give up.
All right. Well, yeah, Elon Musk is pretty much a chainsaw wielding maniac now. I'm sure.
Yes, he's like a dual chainsaw welder. He's an arch villain. He's crazy. Did you see that he like left his kid behind at some press conference lately? They were like, Elon, your 4-year-old son, like he's just walking away. And
Yeah, literally just him in the White House, him on his shoulders playing with Trump. It was weird.
it's totally weird. And it's weird to see Trump let anybody upstage him. So it's kind of interesting. Trump doesn't tend to get along with people for very long. And because they're both narcissists, it's going to be very interesting to
It's
see.
just going to be an implosion.
There's going to be drama. And I've got to tell you, I will be eating popcorn. for that. You know those gifts where you see somebody just eating lots of popcorn?
Yeah.
I'm so ready for the drama.
So stepping away from how bleak things are over there, what have been your impressions of Pakistan before you arrived, and how do you see the country now?
Sure. I mean, I didn't, apart from reading it in the news and having Pakistani friends. I mean, as you know, your your father and I were schoolmates at Amherst College in undergrad together. So, I've had exposure to the culture and friends from the region. It's my first time in Southeast Asia completely. I've never had the opportunity, frankly, to be anywhere in Asia before. So much of my work is domestic. And I did some of my studies in Europe, but my opportunities to travel have been sadly limited so far. Just often, I'm a bit of a workaholic. It's my own fault. But for me, even though I'm on book deadline, um, my agent is probably not thrilled that I took time out from finishing my book to come. But I'm thrilled to be here. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Everybody has been so gracious. And it's really people, I mean, you can tell I've lost my voice. The second day of the festival, I had no voice at all. And even where I'm staying, people, they saw that and they were just, I felt like I got adopted. Like people were treating me like family and trying to help me, and it was incredibly kind. So the hospitality is overwhelming. The city is vibrant, and I just feel really lucky. It's not often you get to travel to a place that's new to you, but with the people, and it's their home, and you're with them. So just having that opportunity to experience the culture, to feel so welcome, and also to be in an environment which is more familiar to me, which is this international literary family. And I've made new friends in a few short days. It's been a wonderful experience. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I hope I get to come back and see the north. I love mountains. I rock climb, and hopefully one day.
You definitely should check it out.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. If I weren't on book deadline, I would have tried to extend my trip for sure.
All right, well, I don't want to keep you anymore at risk of you losing your voice, but thank you.
Thank you. I hope this was what you needed, and if it's not, again, I really don't mind you following up. It's not a problem.
No, it's fine. You were perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you for the kind questions.